The Atlanta Falcons have one person to blame for their loss to the New York Jets in Week 13. It's General Manager Terry Fontenot.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network on the planet, which means it's #1 in the galaxy. Today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by FanDuel. If you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. We thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod. You are the reason why Locked On Falcons, as well as so many other shows across the Locked On Podcast Network, why Locked On is #1 in the galaxy. All you got to do to help us maintain our grip on galactic domination is become an everydayer of this podcast. So all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com. In today's episode, we are reviewing the All-22 film from the Falcons' Week 13 loss to the New York Jets, and we will be absolutely pushing an anti-Terry Fontenot agenda. We will be relating all the issues to Terry Fontenot being a terrible GM, and it's just, pushing, this man needs to be up out the paint at the end of the season, just 5 more weeks of Terry being a terrorist. I'm sure some of these things will be, I think the first issue when we talk about the Falcons' struggles in the cornerback position is directly related to Terry Fontenot. We'll talk about the young pass rusher stepping up, and then we'll revisit the James Pearce trade, which, is more of a Terry issue than the James Pearce trade. I'll explain James Pearce issue. So I'll explain why. And then we'll talk about the Falcons' play action passing and why it was a little bit of a regression. There's some, and that's going to be a little bit more of a stretch to blame that on Terry Fontenot, but we'll get there. So, obviously the Falcons defense played well in the first half in this Jets game. They gave up 7 points, but that was mostly on a muff punt due to special teams. And so essentially blanked the Jets in the first half defensively, but then gave up 20 points in the second half. And to me, the biggest reason why the Jets had so much more success in the second half was that they basically were like, oh yeah, Mike Hughes is the Falcons' other corner, and so we're just going to attack him. And they really found a lot of success throwing to A.D. Mitchell, who they just acquired in the Sauce Gardner trade. So the Falcons got both into that trade with the Colts and Sauce Gardner and A.D. Mitchell with the Jets. But A.D. Mitchell's, based on my charting, against Mike Hughes, had 7 catches on 8 targets for 97 yards, 1 touchdown, and was successful on 6 of 8 of those targets. So a 67% success rate. A.D. Mitchell, against anybody else who was covering him in this game, had 1 catch for 4 targets, 5 yards, and no touchdowns, and was successful on just 1 of 4 plays, so a 25% success rate. Mike Hughes was targeted just 3 times in the first half, but he was targeted 7 times in the second half, and it would have been 8 times had that pass that Alan Lazard caught off of a ricochet not been ricocheted. That Tyrod Taylor was, I believe it was A.D. Mitchell on that play, was trying to throw a fade ball down the field for a potential another touchdown against Mike Hughes on that particular play. And so in the second half of this game, Mike Hughes' target rate in terms of the percentage of Tyrod Taylor's throws that were at Mike Hughes was 35%. And to me, that's notable because the best year that Julio Jones had in terms of his target rate was 2015, where he was targeted on 33% of all of Matt Ryan's throws. And so essentially what that stat, or, maybe it's a stretch, but that stat is basically saying Mike Hughes was as bad at corner as Julio Jones was as good at wide receiver during his peak season. And so I'm blaming this on Terry Fontenot because Terry ignored the cornerback need. And this, to me, is emblematic of the entire Terry Fontenot era and why Terry Fontenot, I'm not going to say he's a terrible GM. I don't think he's a good GM. He's middling, and there's no reason for him to be brought back. But, we won't get into all the reasons for that rant, but we'll just use this to illustrate that. But, the Falcons have been very reactive under Terry Fontenot. And to me, this is not a sustainable way to win, right? And what I mean by reactive is that every offseason, they're trying to address the needs that they ignored the previous year. Now, you go back to 2023. Now, we here on Locked On Falcons, we were believers that Desmond Ridder would have been a good enough answer at the quarterback position. We were obviously wrong. The rest of the world did not agree with that assessment, and rightfully, through the power of hindsight, knew that the quarterback need was a massive win for the Falcons. The Falcons ignored that offseason, and they paid for it dearly in that 2023 season. The following offseason, they double dipped on the quarterback position with Kirk and Penix, and then they ignored their edge rusher need that the rest of the world, including myself, all recognized was a massive need. And the Falcons paid dearly for that in 2024. 2025, they double dip on the edge rusher to make up for it with James Pearce and Jalen Walker, right? And they ignored their cornerback need, right? We talked about this where, what Mike Hughes is Mike Hughes is a stopgap, but the goal is to draft a cornerback in the second round of the draft. The Falcons obviously decided we would rather get James Pearce, which contributes to probably one of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit more critical of that trade, more on that later, than most people are. And so because the Falcons ignored the cornerback need, it probably means if you keep Terry Fontenot, hey, maybe they might finally address it with the second round pick they have next year, because they can't address it with the first round pick. But, they also might address the wide receiver position, more on that later. But it's basically the point I'm trying to make is it's a dog chasing its tail. And this is, to me, an unsustainable way for the Falcons to win. And to me, it embodies the mediocrity that this team has been, inundated with over the last 5 years under Terry Fontenot. And I say this because 3 weeks ago after the Germany game against the Colts, I put out a poll about whether or not people think that Terry Fontenot should keep his job after this season. And 48% of the respondents here on the YouTube side of things for the Locked On Falcons community said 48% said yes, keep Terry. 38% said no, get rid of him. And 14% were at that point undecided. And so I'm interpreting that as, 60% were basically leaning in favor of keeping Terry, and 40% were against it. And to me, my perspective is that shouldn't be a 60-40 split. That should be at most a 20-80 split. 20 keep, 80% get rid of. And the only reason it's 20 is because you can't get, that's just the norm. You can't get thousands of people to agree on the subject to be a 0-100 split. But I don't understand why people are out here advocating for Terry Fontenot. This man is a terrorist. He has ruined the Falcons. And to me, watching Mike Hughes get carved up in this game, as Mike Hughes has been getting carved up pretty much consistently since the 49ers game. And the other element of that is we're only getting the tip of the iceberg in what this secondary could have looked like if opposing teams didn't have such bad injury luck. The Falcons have dodged so many bullets when it has come to opposing teams having either their top tight end or their number 2 wide receiver or number 1 wide receiver in some cases out of the lineup, right? You go back to week 1, Chris Godwin didn't play. Week 2, Jordan Addison was suspended in that game. Week 4, Terry McLaurin didn't play. Week 6, Dalton Kincaid didn't play. Week 7, Brandon Ayuk didn't play. Week 8, Tyreek Hill didn't play. Then you had Rashid Shaheed last week. You didn't have Garrett Wilson this week. And so if you imagine the Falcons not benefiting from this injury luck of these top tier wide receivers and tight ends being out of lineup, this secondary would have been eviscerated to a far higher degree, in my humble opinion, than what we are currently seeing. So to me, basically this secondary is probably 40% worse than what the stats are saying it is at this point in time. And to me, that's directly owed to Terry Fontenot ignoring needs with the cornerback position. So hopefully the Falcons will address that in the future, but hopefully it will not involve Terry Fontenot, and we'll have a competent general manager that will be far less reactive and will be able to solve this cornerback position need that has been a need since Terry Fontenot arrived here, that he has largely ignored outside of the Jeff Okudah trade, and basically oh, well, we tried with Jeff Okudah and it didn't work, and so we'll just ignore it for the rest of eternity. And again, these are the reasons why Terry Fontenot is a terrorist. But, another reason why I'm not a huge fan of Terry Fontenot is even trading a future number 1 pick away. And I want to explain why that's less of a James Pearce issue. I think there were a lot of things that James Pearce and Jalen Walker showed in this game that make me optimistic about their future, but I still have some issues with that trade, and I'll explain what those are as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is brought to you by Aura Frames. If you're shopping for the perfect gift this holiday season, you're looking for something meaningful, personal, and guaranteed to get a reaction, Aura Frames is the gift that delivers every time. It's not just something you wrap, it's something that you can do to share the memories. Because Aura isn't your average picture frame, you can preload the frame with photos before gifting it, so when they plug it in, the memories are already there. No apps to figure out, no setup headaches, just instant smiles. It's the perfect gift for grandparents, parents, newlyweds, anyone who loves photos. And for a limited time, you can save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com, and you'll get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver Mat frames, which were named #1 by Wirecutter. All you got to do is use the promo code LOCKEDON at checkout. That's auraframes.com, promo code LOCKEDON. And this deal is exclusive to our listeners, and the frames sell out fast. So order yours now and get it in time for the holidays. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode is also brought to you by Georgia Access. Have your health or family needs changed lately? Georgia's got you covered. Georgia Access is our state's marketplace for Georgians to compare, apply, and enroll in health insurance plans that offer the best value for their individual needs. Open enrollment is happening right now. All you got to do is visit georgiaaccess.gov today. Georgia Access, health insurance for Georgia by Georgia. So continuing with today's Locked On Falcons, before we get there, I do want to thank you once again for making Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And we can thank you, the everydayers, for making that possible. So one of the big talking points we talked about last week was the Falcons developing a four-man rush. Their four-man rush was effective in this game, but it didn't dominate in the ways that it did against the Saints last week. And that was one of the things that we thought going into this game, because we figured that the Jets' offensive line was going to be better, particularly with their young tackles, to be able to handle the Falcons' edge rushers, which are the primary drivers of this Falcons four-man pass rush and its effectiveness. But I think part of it was the Falcons offense did not perform in the first half the way that they needed to build that early lead that they were able to build against the Saints, and that allowed that four-man rush to really pin their ears back and get after the quarterback last week. But the Falcons did have a lead late in the game, 24-17 with 9 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. And thereafter, the Jets ran 16 pass plays. According to PFF, the Falcons got pressure on 6 of those 16 pass plays, so about 38% pressure rate, which is slightly above average, 35% being roughly average, a healthy pressure rate. My charting had the Falcons getting pressure on 11 of those 16 plays. We've talked before about how I tend to be a little bit more generous on what I count as a pressure than what websites like PFF count. So that was a 69% pressure rate for the Falcons in those final 16 plays. But, focusing on the PFF pressures, Jalen Walker accounted for 2 of those 6 pressures. James Pearce had 2 of the other 6 pressures. And so the 2 rookies having 4 of the 6 pressures is something that you want to see. Those guys stepping up in the critical moments in order to win in those situations. And one of those pressures for James Pearce was an unblocked pressure, but the other one was that sack that he had against Armand Mimbu on a nice inside spin move. Jalen Walker also had a pressure in that situation as an off-ball linebacker. There was an earlier play, I believe, in the second quarter where he lined up as an off-ball linebacker that PFF didn't count as a pressure, but he did win in that situation. And that's something that the Falcons have been adding to the wrinkle. They usually unveil it once or twice a game, where Jalen Walker will line up basically as a Mike linebacker, and he'll rush through the A-gap. And in previous games, when they've done that, it's resulted in other players getting sacks. And this week, to me, was notable because this was the first time that Jalen Walker himself was winning in that situation, which is something that we thought going into the season he would be able to win much more effectively against guards and running backs than what he has this year. Most of his wins have come against tackles, but it is nice to sort of see, if he can not only win against tackles, because I know he had a pressure late in the game where he beat Olu Fashanu on a long arm. If he can do that and beat the guards and the running backs and whatnot, that's where Jalen Walker starts to live up to the hype of being that guy that can line up anywhere and win any type of way. So seeing that sort of him start to win a little bit more consistently, hopefully that will continue against non-tackles, I think is a big sign of direction. But let's talk about James Pearce, right? And let's talk about the James Pearce trade. I know I'm a hater and all that stuff, but I'm trying to build to a point, right? And my point is get rid of Terry Fontenot. It's going to sound like hating on James Pearce for a second. The knock on James Pearce, and the reason why I'm much more reluctant to praise that trade is, my anti-Terry Fontenot agenda, but also because James Pearce at this point in time, and we'll see where he projects to be, but right now he projects to be a DPR, a designated pass rusher, meaning a guy that comes in primarily on obvious passing situations to rush the quarterback. And one of the defenses of this trade, where the Falcons, if the draft was tomorrow, I believe would be giving up the 9th overall selection, so a top 10 pick, is that James Pearce would have been a top 10 pick in any draft if not for all the character issues that surrounded him in the pre-draft process. I don't agree with that, because James Pearce projects as a DPR, and NFL teams typically do not take DPRs in the top 10. Right? You can argue the last time a team, quote unquote, successfully took a DPR in the top 10 was 2015, which was Dante Fowler and or Vic Beasley in those years. Now, DPRs do go in the teens, like Will McDonald was drafted at 15 a couple of years ago. But even when Will McDonald went 15, a lot of people criticized that, like, you're taking a DPR this high in the draft, right? DPRs go all the time in the 20s. And so the point I'm trying to make is, like, I think in most drafts, James Pearce, based off of how he projects to the NFL as a DPR, would have been a guy that would have been drafted in the latter half of round one, not the top half of round one. And so that defense of that trade to me doesn't pass the smell test to me. Now, in order for James Pearce to live up to being a top 10 pick, in my humble opinion, he either has to make massive improvements as a run defender so that he becomes more of an every down player than a DPR, which, again, maybe that happens, but good luck with that. Or more likely, he's going to have to become one of the more consistent DPRs in the NFL. And I think that is a much more achievable dream at this point, right? Now, the concern with James Pearce is, in order that may limit his ability as a DPR, is that he may not be able to win in a multitude of ways like the best pass rushers can in the NFL, right? One of the things that stood out to me on this particular film was a number of times where he tried to bull rush Olu Fashanu in this game, and he couldn't generate the power to do so. And to me, that's notable just because, Fashanu, at least coming out of Penn State a couple of years ago, like the biggest knock on him was that he was a little light in the pants and was susceptible to power. And so James Pearce not being able to generate that power against a guy that's noted to be light in the pants is notable, in the sense of having that concern that we talked about post-draft, which is James Pearce has power, but is it enough power to really scare NFL offensive tackles? So far, the answer is not really, but we'll see if that develops in the future. But all that hating to say, to build to this point, is that the fact that James Pearce, if he's not going to be this, multi-speed and power guy, and if he's going to primarily be a speed guy, which I think is where most people, including myself, projected him to be, you like seeing that inside spin move, because basically, that's building a counter off of your speed rush. And the main reason why you're hopeful that James Pearce is not going to go the way of Vic Beasley, who was very effective early in his career as a speed rusher, but when offensive tackles made the adjustments, he wasn't able to build counters off of that. That seeing James Pearce pull off this inside spin move makes you a little bit more optimistic that he's going to be different than Vic Beasley, better than Vic Beasley, be primarily still a speed rusher, but knows how to build counters off of that. That at least makes him at least twice as effective as Vic Beasley was as a speed rusher. And that, to me, hopefully will make him, worthwhile of a top 10 pick. So again, it sounds like I'm hating on James Pearce. My issue with the trade is not a James Pearce issue. It's not, James Pearce is bad, and so therefore the trade is not worth it. Most of that is just like, I think people are putting the cart before the horse, which is basically like, 12 games into James Pearce's career, he's already proven that he's been worth the pick. And I'm just like, that's going to have to play out over multiple years to see how he develops as a, complete pass rusher, which, again, not sitting here going like, oh my God, James Pearce isn't a fully finished product 12 games into his NFL career. Like, of course he's not. That's why, like, when people defend a trade acting like we know that James Pearce is going to be good at this point in time, I'm like, let's pump the brakes on that. My issue with the trade is just Terry Fontenot. It's a bad process, right? Drafting a DPR, again, no knock on James Pearce, but drafting a DPR with what is going to be a top 10 pick. And obviously Terry Fontenot and company, they thought they were giving away a mid-20s pick, but like that speaks to the bad process that the Falcons have. And so often we're sitting here defending Terry Fontenot's big swings as like, it's a bad process, but hey, if we get the right result, it's worthwhile. And that's still true with James Pearce. If we get the right result with James Pearce down the road, as he develops into one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, we'll sit here and defend that trade. But like, how can you continue to defend a general manager that repeatedly has such a terrible process to how he approaches team building, but you're just hoping that you just kind of luck into the right results? And so that is my way of connecting James Pearce's success with Terry Fontenot being terrible, which I know is counterintuitive to a lot of folks. So we'll see how much of a stretch I have to make in order to connect the Falcons' play action struggles to Terry Fontenot as a poor team building. But again, we're pushing agendas today. So we will wrap up today's episode talking about why, even though the play action statistically was still productive in this game, it felt like the Falcons offense was far too limited. And that was embodied in some ways with their play action passing, I think regressing, particularly in how they use Kyle Pitts. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So NFL Sundays move fast, whether it's one big play and suddenly everything feels different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place live bets as the action unfolds, every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift, a receiver gets hot, the defense tightens up, or that big momentum flips after a turnover, and FanDuel's going to let you jump into each and every moment with live spreads and money lines that adjust instantly, player props that update as guys heat up, and you can also bet on who's going to score the next touchdown, different drive results, totals, and so much more. It keeps you locked in with every snap, every drive, every possibility. So if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, just visit FanDuel.com, download the FanDuel app, and place your NFL live bets all season long. FanDuel, the game moves fast, and so can you. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, talking about the offense, we saw once again a hefty dose of under center and play action in this game like we saw last week. I think the Falcons benefited from breaking their tendencies last week against the Saints and caught the Saints sleeping in that regard. And I think the Jets were better prepared for it in this. You look at the two biggest explosive plays in this game for the Falcons, awful play action. So 42-yard play to Bijan, a 31-yard play to Tyler Algier, but both of those were checkdowns, right? Where in both instances, you had a linebacker out of position. On the Bijan one, the linebacker blitzed instead of dropping the coverage. On the Algier one, Quincy Williams, the linebacker, slipped. He thought he got held. And so instead of pursuing the ball, he was complaining to the refs, and that left Tyler Algier to just rumble for another 30 plus yards. And so it's not to take away from those plays, but the design of those plays isn't simply like, oh, we're going to check the ball down to Bijan or Algier and we're going to get 30, 40 yards a pop. Right now, other outside of those plays, the Falcons were generally efficient. Right, you look at those two plays; they really skew the numbers. It's basically doubling the amount of play action passing yards they had. But outside of those two plays, the Falcons were generally very efficient via play action. Kirk was 8 of 10, I believe, on for 67 yards off of the other play action plays. He had a 70% success rate on the rest of those play action plays. But my two main knocks on the Falcons offense in this game, one is specific to their usage of Kyle Pitts in the play action, and one I think is more encompasses the offense overall, but is also related to the play action. The play action specific one with Pitts was, to me, I think the Falcons regressed a little bit with asking Kyle Pitts to be more of an underneath option in the play action game. And the overall one, which is a similar issue, which is I think too much of the Falcons game plan was related to was trying to be dink and dunk, right? A lot of checkdowns, a lot of screens, a lot of quick game concepts, but talking about Kyle Pitts, right? He did have opportunities down the field as a route runner. That was something that you guys know we noted on the podcast during the offseason, which is when you looked at Kyle Pitts' usage in the play action in 2024, it was almost exclusively as a blocker and chipper, and he almost never got to run down the field. Literally only 2 routes the entire season that ran more than 5 yards on play action, and only 13 routes overall off of play action last year. That has been a welcome change, where the Falcons have been utilizing Pitts a lot more down the field, and they've been successful. That's, to me, a big reason why you've seen an uptick in their play action over the last month, which has been they've been able to target Kyle Pitts on those downfield throws. But to me, this game, he still had opportunities, but it felt a lot more like the 2024 season, where a lot more time blocking, a lot more chips, a lot more underneath stuff. And I think that it looks a little bit more questionable, especially when you see who the Falcons had at wide receiver. It'd be different, if you had Drake London and Darnell Mooney both playing at a high level, like you can understand that, like those guys can make the plays down the field. But when you look at who the Falcons had at wide receiver in this particular game, it's like, why are we limiting Kyle Pitts, right? And that gets to the overall issue, which is the dink and dunk. Like I said, a lot of checkdowns, a lot of screens, a lot of quick game concepts. Kirk Cousins's average depth of target in this game was 5.3 yards. which is the lowest ADOT that he's had in all 17 of his starts since joining the Falcons. We saw a lot of the issues that we've seen throughout the season with the wide receivers. They really struggled to beat man coverage. I know late in the game, the Jets switched to a lot of two-man, two deep safeties with man coverage underneath. And Pitts was the only guy that was like quasi-reliable at getting open in those situations, similar to what we saw against the 49ers earlier this season. And like, then it was like, very concerning where it's like, why isn't Drake London getting open? But now it's like, oh, of course, David Sills and Dylan Drummond and Devin Tompkins aren't getting open. And that relates to, I think, a topic of discussion, particularly given some of the comments that Raheem Morris made on Monday in his presser when he was asked about some of the decisions to play certain wide receivers over others. As you guys well know, Casey Washington and Kadero Hodge were healthy scratches this week. The Hodge one, certainly when you look at, benching essentially your best special teams player and that having a negative impact, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Falcons special teams coverage and other areas struggled so much in this game with Hodge out of the lineup. And then when you look at the other receivers, David Sills, Dylan Drummond, Devin Tompkins getting a little bit more run. To me, what's sort of interesting about that is, like, I think in a lot of ways, those three guys are just kind of poor man's versions of Kadero Hodge and Ray-Ray McCloud. Hodge has been basically marginalized in this offense. He's only really gotten significant action in one game this year against Miami, and I thought he played reasonably well in that game. Nobody played particularly well in that game, but he was one of the few standouts. I broke that down for the Locked On Falcons Insiders in the extended all 22 review. And then, of course, we know that Ray-Ray McCloud was kind of an afterthought in the offense for the first month before he was released. And I think a lot of the things that the Falcons are trying to do with Sills and Drummond and Tompkins are some of the things that they were doing successfully with Hodge and McCloud last year that for whatever reason they have chosen not to do that. And it's probably related to the Ike Hilliard firing and all that sort of stuff. But like the Falcons' choices at wide receiver, I think have been interesting. We try to give the coaches the benefit of the doubt when it comes to who plays and who doesn't play. But, a big reason why the Falcons offense has taken a considerable step back is because of the downturn at the wide receiver position. And whether you want to blame that on Ike Hilliard or TJ Yates or Darnell Mooney or whoever you want to blame that on, we're going to blame it on Terry Fontenot. All right. And it goes back to a conversation we had this offseason, right? Where we talked about, the Falcons, if you could make one investment on the offense side of the ball that would do the most help for the Falcons, it would be the wide receiver position. But we talked about this back in January, February, where it's like, we know that that's not going to happen because the Falcons have so many other pressing needs on the defense side of the ball, and they have so many limited resources that they can't really afford to, quote unquote, waste one on an offensive player and just trust in that Zach Robinson and Michael Penix and all the pieces returning will just be better in year two. And obviously they haven't been better. Drake London has played great, but injuries have been a much bigger issue for Drake this year. Obviously, Darnell Mooney has had a massive fall off, right? And then Hodge and McCloud are basically non-factors in the offense. And the Sills and the Casey Washingtons and the Dylan Drummonds and the Devin Tompkins have not come anywhere close, in my opinion, of making up that ground. And so it just gets back to, again, the bad process with Terry Fontenot, where the fact that his constant decision to trade it away draft assets and limit their resources to me limits this team's ability to improve their roster, and they're set up for another offseason like that. They're currently only have 5 picks in the 2026 draft. They're currently, according to Over the Cap, only have $3 million in salary cap space. Now, obviously, they're going to be able to open up more, potentially with cuts of Kirk Cousins and Darnell Mooney, et cetera, this offseason, and maybe some trades and whatnot. Not Bijan Robinson, right? I know. That was a firestorm. Honey, you got a storm coming with people with that one. But that was for those of you that missed it, that was a thought experiment last week, but some people got very upset about that. That thought experiment. How dare you, Aaron, make me think about trading Bijan Robinson. It's just this cycle that's just going to continue to repeat. And again, it's just part of my anti-Terry Fontenot agenda. So let me know why I'm wrong about Terry Fontenot, because, hey, he drafted this one guy that's looking successful. And it's like, all right, man, you got to build a roster of 53 guys, but I'm glad you're happy about literally 2% of the roster doing good. Again, I know you guys are going to, it's more than one guy, Aaron. It's like 6 guys. And it's like, okay, all right. What is that? 12% of the roster? Great. Awesome. You're doing great. 11%, I guess, cool, man. Yeah. What about the other 89% of the roster? So let me know why I'm wrong about Terry Fontenot, and I will mute you. Like, you're just wrong. Get out. But that's what's in store. We'll break down some of these plays. We'll talk about some of the play action stuff. We'll look at these receivers stinking. We'll look at James Pearce and Jalen Walker and their highlights, as well as some of the positive plays from Xavier Watts. Do you guys need to see Mike Hughes get cooked in this game to let that sink in? Maybe we'll show some of that for the extended all 22 review, which will be actual film of the plays that we're talking about on this podcast. You can sign up for that for free right now, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that point. If you hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. And so check that out. We'll be back with a crossover Thursday with Locked On Seahawks tomorrow. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, you can check out the great shows like Locked On Seahawks, Locked On Hawks, and Locked On so many other shows across the Locked On Podcast Network, including Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily to get you the scoop on all this upcoming Week 14 action. It is all part of the #1 sports podcast network on the planet, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.